Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are returning to September 2011, often referred to as Tengu Plan format, and taking our very first deep dive look at TGs, specifically TG Stun. TG was not a new deck in September 2011. As a matter of fact, it actually won the 2011 US Nationals. But in September of 2011, it was another one of the top decks heading into YCS Toronto, and then definitely a deck to take into consideration at the subsequent event in YCS Columbus. At YCS Toronto, it actually had three different versions in the top 32, an agent version, a pure version, and then what I consider a stun version. The deck we're going to profile today is specifically TG Stun, and what differentiates the TG Stun from sort of the pure control version is the difference between playing either Skill Drain and Barbaros, which is what we're going to profile today at the hands of Tyler Nolan, versus the version that Robert Boyajian used to top 32 with hand traps like Max C. This is actually the exact main deck that I lost to in the top 32 of YCS Toronto. I lost to Tyler Nolan. Tyler was a really well-known player of stun trap-heavy decks at the time. I used to call him the plant killer because his decks, particularly during that part of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, were geared so well to beating up on plant decks. I was a victim of him, and many other plant players during that time period were a victim of not only his playstyle, but his ability to pilot these decks with a lot of success. So I lost to TGs at Toronto, and it was actually my only Swiss loss at Columbus as well. So TGs during this time period were really well-tuned to fight against the plant synchro decks that became incredibly popular during this period. But regardless, today we're going to look at TG Stun. It's going to be a deck that combines the power of TG monsters, and TG monsters themselves have a lot going on for them. One, when they are destroyed during the end phase, you get to search another. Very similar to Dark Soul, they don't trigger off of synchro summoning, but destruction by battle and other means, they do get to do that, which means one TG often gives you access to all 9 of your TGs, meaning 3 Striker, 3 Werewolf, and 3 Rush Rhino. And it makes it so that you basically always have a monster. 2/3 of them, between Werewolf and Rush Rhino, function really well with Horn of the Phantom Beast, one of the most powerful trap cards of the format. You also get to run Reborn Tengu and Beast King Barbaros, with both function well with Horn of the Phantom Beast, which makes it really difficult for your opponent to outgrind you because all of your monsters replace each other, minus Barbaros. And if Barbaros isn't replacing each other itself, you have to worry about it being combined with Skill Drain, and then all of the traps that this deck runs, nearly 20, if not 20 plus as a matter of fact, make it really hard to push through. Even with Heavy Storm being unbanned, which is something to put into consideration, one of the changes from summer 2011 to fall 2011 was the unbanning of Heavy Storm, and this deck was still really difficult to play against. This deck is going to end up main decking 2 copies of Starlight Road with 2 copies of Stardust Dragon in the extra deck to compensate for the unbanning of Heavy Storm. But regardless, even with Heavy Storm legal, this was a really difficult deck to play against. It really beat up on plant decks. I went 0-2 the 2 times I played against TGs during this format. I lost in the top 32 of Columbus, or rather Toronto, and I lost in the Swiss of Columbus against TGs. So it really was a perfect anti-meta deck that gave you a lot of tools anyway. Sometimes you think of anti-meta, you think of just stun cards and it really trying this really narrow game plan. Not really. This deck has a lot of cool tools to it. This deck does get to access the extra deck. Striker is a fantastic tuner. TG1, EM1, that gets to flip a control of a monster from one side of the field to the other, is an unbelievable, very unique trap card that's almost impossible to play around. So to me, TG, in retrospect, was right up there with plants. It may not have been as popular because plants were maybe more inherently enjoyable to play, but in terms of actually winning events during this time period, or at least having a chance, TG is really right up there with all of the others. You know, if you wanted to play a stun-heavy deck and your options were Hero Beat, Gravekeepers, and TGs, I think TG may have been the best one. I think it just gave you the best flexibility against the meta decks like Karakuri, Plant, and Agent. But I also think the ability of just outgrinding the opponent gave you a leg up against some of the more stun decks anyway. You know, for example, if you're playing against Hero Beat, your opponent doesn't really get any value from Hero Blasting a TG monster or Gemini Sparking a TG monster. And those monsters' attack thresholds are really difficult to deal with when you're talking about Rush Rhino attacking. Obviously not when it's being attacked, but when it is attacking, that 2000 boost is all of a sudden really difficult to play against. So to me, TG is right up there. I've elected to go with the stun deck because I think it's a cool deck with the Skill Drain package with Barbaros. Though I'm not going to immediately profile, there are other versions of this deck. Like I mentioned, Robert Boyajian, really well-known player at the time, actually works for Konami now, elected to play a hand trap version of this deck that also top 32'd. So you do actually have a couple ways of going about building this deck. But without further ado, we're going to take a deep dive look at specifically Tyler Nolan's main deck from YCS Toronto, and a side deck that I think is a bit of a hybrid between Robbie's and Tyler's. And I'm specifically going to pinpoint this deck as legal at YCS Columbus, which is an important thing to make note of because that means Dark Worlds are legal. So I added a couple cards in the side deck, or at least acknowledged the existence of a couple cards in the side deck. in anticipation of potentially playing against Dark World. Otherwise, if you want to play YCS Toronto, the only difference would be that Dark World wouldn't be legal. But without further ado, let's take our very first deep dive look at TG Stun. All right, we'll start the deck profile off with the deck's namesake, which is the TG engine. We'll start with this deck's only tuner, which is 3 copies of TG Striker. Striker is a Cyber Dragon that, of course, has the effect that all TGs have, which I'll talk about once I display all of them. But there's 3 TG Strikers, which is a tuner that's a Cyber Dragon. 3 TG Werewolf that allows you to special summon it from your hand on either player's turn when anybody special summons a level 4 or lower monster. So you could special summon this, kind of surprise your opponent with a blocker. You can special summon it in the aftermath of summoning Striker, and then immediately go into the extra deck for a level 5 Synchro monster like Catastor without using your normal summon. And then there's 3 copy of Rush Rhino, which is the primary beatdown. It has 1600 attack and it boosts up to 2000 attack in battle. Thing to note about this particular card is one of this deck's weaknesses was Thunder King Ryo, assuming your opponent's unwilling to attack into Deep Prison / Mirror Force, and you don't have access to something like Book of Moon or Skill Drain. Having Thunder King Ryo on the field can be really irritating because you basically have 9 copies of Sangan in your deck. This gives you an ability to attack directly over a Thunder King Ryo because it'll boost to 2000, and then obviously that's higher than a Thunder King's 1900. But these are the primary TG monsters. We play maxed out all 3 of them. To note how these function, during the end phase, if they are destroyed, you can search your deck for a different copy. So Rush Rhino can search Striker, and then Striker can search Werewolf, and then Werewolf can search Striker, etc. That happens during the end phase, and it only happens when they are destroyed, either by battle or card effect, which means you do not get to search through the use of Striker as a tuner. So that is something to note, that this deck does have access to the extra deck when it needs to, but in doing so, you're cutting yourself off from searches. Past that, we have 2 additional monsters that function really well in this deck. We have 3 copies of Reborn Tengu, which is not affected by Skill Drain and functions really well with the fact that we have a tuner in our deck and the fact that we have Horn of the Phantom Beast. And then 2 copies of Beast King Barbaros, which works even better with Skill Drain, to be honest, and also functions really well with Horn of the Phantom Beast. This deck really at heart is a beatdown deck, and when we have 3 copies of Rush Rhino, 3 Reborn Tengus, and 2 Beast King Barbaros, we really have a nice core of 8 monsters that on their own are above 1600 attack, and then with Horn of the Phantom Beast can obviously get much higher. So that's the core of our deck. We have the 9 TG monsters, all allowing us to search during the end phase and kind of get the ball rolling. As long as you're aware of Thunder King Ryo and the weakness that this deck has to Ryo. Then we have 3 Reborn Tengus and 2 Beast King Barbaros. Going on into the spell lineup, this deck has a very small spell lineup. We have 3 copies of Pot of Duality. This was a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where stun decks very often played Pot of Duality in the full 3 ofs. Right? You might see this and think in a modern context and say, wow, you really want to play 3 dualities? What happens when you open 2? The game only lasts 1 turn. That's like opening 4 cards instead of 5. Well, these games are going to last forever. If you have open all 3 dualities, that's not really that big of a deal. The game will last 6, 7, 8 turns. You'll eventually get to activate all 3 of them. This deck doesn't really rely on special summoning. It definitely can. You have Tengu in your deck. You do occasionally go into the extra deck through Striker, but it's really not a primary game plan. So 3 dualities is really free. Then we have Book of Moon, which is just a fantastic out to Thunder King Ryo and just a generically powerful card anyway. Dark Hole, which you could consider a staple at this time. This deck also doesn't really get hurt if the board gets clogged up on both sides of the field, right? You Dark Hole in your field is just TG monsters that search and Reborn Tengus that search. Yeah, Barbaros wouldn't do anything, but otherwise, if the board gets really clogged, your opponent plays Dark Hole, you play Dark Hole. A lot of times that doesn't even really matter. So there's Dark Hole, and then this deck elected to play a copy of Monster Reborn, particularly Tyler's deck elected to play a copy of Monster Reborn. Right, this deck's not making huge pushes and using this per se as an extender, but you can Monster Reborn a tuner on either graveyard. You can Reborn Beast King Barbaros, and it'll come out as a 3000, which actually happens every now and then when you play those cards in the deck. So there's definitely a few pieces of utility there. And then really what makes this deck is the trap lineup. This deck at heart is a beatdown stun deck with a big heavy trap lineup. The first card we have is 3 copies of Horn of the Phantom Beast. Horn of the Phantom Beast is obviously an incredible card. You target a beast or beast warrior monster, which again, this deck has a ton of those. You have 3 copies of Tengu. You have 2 copies of Barbaros. You have 3 Rush Rhinos, which is a beast. You have all 3 of the werewolves, and the only one that you don't get to use is Striker. So if that ever does come up, Striker is actually just a warrior. So all of the others are beasts. You can kind of tell by the picture that this one's definitely not a beast in reference to any of the others. But that is something to note, that if you do play this deck, you might assume that this card works on every single deck, every single card in your main deck. whereas it doesn't work with Striker, so that is something to take into consideration. But otherwise, this card boosts your monster by 800 attack, which means it can be used in the damage step. And then from that point forward, if the monster equipped with Horn of the Phantom Beast destroys an opponent's monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, you get to draw a card, which is obviously incredible. This card makes it so that it's really hard for your opponent to beat you in battle, because they need to not only have more attack than your relatively large monsters in general, but they also have to take into consideration that during the damage step, you could simply flip Horn of the Phantom Beast after the point where they can use something like Enemy Controller / Book of Moon, and now all of a sudden they just crash their monster into your monster, which is bad for them, and you got to draw a card. And now going forward, every single time your monster battles and destroys one of theirs by battle and sends it to the graveyard, and that part technically is important. This format has things like Dandelion, which obviously won't go to the graveyard, particularly the tokens. Obviously actual Dandelion, but not the tokens. So that is something to consider. But at any point going forward, now the opponent is going to continually generate card advantage by drawing a card through battle. So that part is obviously really frustrating when you're playing against this deck, and made this deck one of the more difficult ones to play against. So we are going to max out on Horn of the Phantom Beast. Almost every monster in the deck functions with it. Then we have just a bunch of generically powerful trap cards, right? We have 2 copies of Bottomless Trap Hole. This format has cards like Thunder King Raya, which is obviously a huge problem. Bottomless is just a generically good card. It's good against cards like Hyperion, though granted, we're at a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where they do have priority, but it's still a functional card. So 2 copies of Bottomless. We have the 2 copies of Solemn Warning. Obviously a fantastic card against all of the things that I've just described, and then even things like Reborn Tengu. This deck is elected to run 2 copies of Starlight Road. We are at the very first point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, after quite a while, where Heavy Storm had been unbanned. So Heavy Storm was banned for quite a while. It was unbanned at the start of this format, which really to me was one of the biggest changes. You know, in the summer, you could play this deck. You could even play plant decks, and they were totally reasonable and fine. The plant deck during the summer even had more high power cards. They had 2 Debris, they had more Pot of Avarices, they had double Lone Fire. The actual Tengu plant deck during the summer was more powerful, but it had to play Trunade over Heavy Storm. Not that Trunade's a bad card, it's obviously an insane card, but having to play against decks like X-Sabers when they could just set all their traps, having to play against things like TGs and Gravekeepers especially, even things like Six Samurai where they could just set their entire hand without worrying, it made it somewhat difficult to play a combo-centric deck like Plants. When Heavy Storm was unbanned heading into Toronto, now all of a sudden decks like even honestly the one that I'm showing and Gravekeepers took a pretty reasonable hit because decks like Plant Synchro could play obviously Heavy Storm and then take advantage of that. This style of deck, whether it was this deck or Gravekeepers or even things like Elemental Hero Beatdown decks, in order to compensate for the unbanning of Heavy Storm, you really needed to run a card like Starlight Road. Yes, you technically have Solemn Judgment, but that might not necessarily be enough, just 1 copy of Solemn Judgment. So this deck elects to run 2 copies of Starlight Road. This format also has Dark Hole, also has Black Rose Dragon, right? A lot of plant players will try and go into Black Rose Dragon against a lot of traps. So the existence of Starlight Road, even if you're playing against an opponent who never plays into it, it's still a really powerful card. Plus you have to worry about other cards. Mirror Force, like I mentioned, I may have mentioned Dark Hole already. So there are plenty of cards that could trigger this. So having double Starlight Road is pretty good, especially if you're playing a deck with a floodgate like Skill Drain. So this deck elected to play 2 copies of Skill Drain. Why is Skill Drain so powerful in this deck? Well, think about it. If your primary function with the TG monsters is just to beat down, and you're never really going into the extra deck, all of the TG monsters still get to search during the end phase. Yes, you don't get the boost on Rush Rhino, but it's still a 1600, which is pretty good. And now all of a sudden you have no effects. Your opponent has no effects, you have no effects, but you have 9 cards that just keep searching one another. And it's going to take forever for your opponent to grind through that. Even if your opponent is beating you down with a Cyber Dragon and you're just going set, end phase search, set, end phase search, you are eventually going to win out because you have 9 different cards that search one another, and eventually you'll find an out to their big monster. So you can obviously take more advantage of Skill Drain than the opponent. Plus, Barbaros is insane with Skill Drain for obvious reasons, and Reborn Tengu still searches with Skill Drain. So your entire deck is either benefited by Skill Drain or only marginally affected in the case of Rush Rhino. So 2 copies of Skill Drain, insane in this deck. Then we have 2 copies of Call of the Haunted. Call of the Haunted functioned pretty well in this deck with the ability to special summon Beast King Barbaros as a 3000, but then also recur a TG monster. So 2 copies of Call of the Haunted. You can technically trigger Werewolf with this too, right? Werewolf can be special summoned from the hand whenever a level 4 or lower is special summoned. So you could activate this and then special summon Werewolf if you absolutely wanted to. So 2 copies of Call of the Haunted. And then one of the coolest cards in this game, honestly, one of the main attractions to play TG was to be able to play this particular card, TG1 EM1. What this card does is really cool. If you control a TG, you can switch control of one of your monsters, specifically the TG, with one of your opponent's monsters. It's basically a trap version of Creature Swap, where you get to pick the cards, and now you're giving your opponent a TG monster that when it's destroyed, you get to search during the end phase. So you're actually netting advantage because all the TG monsters obviously let you search, and as long as you're not giving them a tuner they're immediately using, it's just a really hard card to play around, right? It's not like it's a card like Mirror Force and Deep Prison where your opponent has to attack into it. It's not like it's Bottomless where it needs to already be set. You know, really at any point, going first or second with an established board or not, if you have a TG monster and you draw this, you just set it, and now you have this chainable Creature Swap out of nowhere. You can take your opponent's biggest monster, you can take a monster that's really bothering you, you can take a tuner before they synchro, you can take the synchro. If your opponent's threatening Black Rose and you don't have Skill Drain or Solemn Warning, you can take the tuner or the monster that's the non-tuner. Obviously, there's just a ton of interactions where TG1 is just an insane card, and it's one of the coolest cards at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, I think, of all of Yu-Gi-Oh! It's just a trap card that has such a unique effect, right? You look at other cards and you look at Bottomless and Solemn Warning, and yes, they are different. They have different benefits, different detriments, but they are just, generally speaking, removal cards. The same could also be said for cards like Torrential Tribute and Bottomless Trap Hole, Mirror Force, Deep Prison. They all just remove monsters. This card does something very, very, very unique. So that is 2 ofs, and then some of the 1 ofs. I already just commented on 2, 3 of them. Torrential Mirror Force, Tyler elected only to run 1 Deep Prison. You might consider bumping that up. You might consider siding more Deep Prisons. He actually did do that, but he only elected to run 1. Then we have 1 copy of Solemn Judgment, which is pretty obvious in a deck with this many traps. And then Tyler elected to run 1 copy of Dark Bribe, which means he technically has 4 ways to stop the 1 Heavy Storm, which is probably a sufficient quantity. And then if you're really trying to protect Skill Drain, which this deck doesn't necessarily need to do to win, it's not one of those decks that's 100% reliant on Skill Drain, but it can definitely help. Makes it such that when you do stick a Skill Drain, we have plenty of ways to protect it, both from MST, but also from things like Heavy Storm. But that is the main deck. Going on into the extra deck before we go into the side deck. This deck could access the extra deck. The primary ways would be through Monster Reborn, that TG trap that I just referred to, TG1, and then technically the fact that your deck has Striker in it, the TG Striker, the level 2 tuner that has the special summon effect like Cyber Dragon. All right, so we have level 5s. We have Catastor and TG Wonder Magician. These are functional with Special Striker, Special Werewolf, so they're both pretty fine in that case. We're not running Android. That's only going to give us life points. I think TG Wonder Magician is better. It pops a back row, draws a card when it gets destroyed. You're probably not using it for the Formula Synchron effect where you get to synchro on your opponent's main phase, but it is a possibility. This deck can actually play Barkion because both Striker and Rhino are Earth monsters, and you never know, you might play a mirror match, and then that's obviously a blowout card. So we have a copy of Naturia Barkion. Other level 6s are Gaia, because Goyo Guardian is banned, so we need the highest attack threshold. We also have a copy of Orient Dragon, because it's just a generically powerful card in a very synchro-heavy format. Bryanek, because it can just win games out of nowhere. Level 7 might be tough for this deck, but we are playing, at least I am, Cyber Dragon in the side deck. You do have access to Monster Reborn. You do have access to the TG1 trap, so having a couple level 7s isn't a bad idea. The highest attack threshold is Scrap Archfiend, and then we have Black Rose Dragon. For level 8s, we have 1 copy of Scrap Dragon. Again, a tough one to go into. You could go Striker, Werewolf, and go into it, but that's pretty difficult to do. Monster Reborn, though, might change things. So it is useful to have a power level 8 like this. This deck has 2 copies of Stardust Dragon because we played 2 copies of Starlight Road. I could understand cutting one of these. I played decks over the years that had multiple Starlight Roads. Sometimes I played hero decks that had multiple Starlight Roads, and I would occasionally only play one of these if I felt like it really warranted another spot for another monster, because if you're resolving Starlight Road, chances are it's because you've run into Heavy Storm, and you're probably going to win the game special summoning 1 Stardust Dragon and just using Road for the rest of the game as a negation card for things like Dark Hole and Torrential. I could see a time where you would actually need 2 to win, but if there was another card that you think would come up more in a tournament, I could actually understand not playing both Stardust Dragons with 2 Starlight Roads, but Tyler elected to do it. I think it's acceptable. The only card that I would consider maybe putting in is actually a Roach, which he's not going to be playing, which I'll comment on in just a second. In terms of level 9, we have Trishula. Technically, if you open all of the TGs, you could go special, special, normal, and then go into level 9. If you think that's worthwhile and foregoing all of your end phase searches, it's worth having the option. We are at the start of the X-Seed monsters, so we have Gachi Gachi when we have 2 strikers. We have Leviathan Dragon when we have 2 werewolves, and then we have Utopia when we either have 2 rhinos or rhino plus Tengu. That's 15. You could find a way to fit Roach in there. This was a format where Hyperion-based decks, and then even Karakuri, honestly, were pretty popular. So you might have wanted it out to some of the high-level monsters that could be special summoned. Maybe you cut the Stardust. Maybe you cut Gachi Gachi, who's, you know, not even all that great. I don't know if I'd really want to turn 2 strikers into Gachi Gachi, but something to consider. I would probably find a spot for Roach. In terms of what you could anticipate playing against, and then the side deck, at this time, I have Dark Worlds, because as I mentioned in the intro, I am basing this off of Columbus and not necessarily just Toronto. A lot of people play Toronto. If you play Toronto, obviously you don't get to play these. If you play Columbus, obviously the format's going to shift a little bit, and you are going to be able to play with Dark World monsters, so that is something to take into consideration. We have X-Sabers. X-Sabers may have been more popular at Columbus for an unusual reason than at any other point. Columbus was the last YCS that Dark Soul could search multiple times off a single copy, and I know for a fact X-Saber aficionados like San Pedigo actually played X-Sabers, not because they necessarily thought the deck was going to win the event, but because they wanted to play Dark Soul that way for the last time. So you might actually want it to, at least in the back of your mind, consider it X-Sabers, not necessarily because it was a good meta call, but just because players wanted to use Dark Soul like that one last time. You could have played the mirror match, could have played against Karakuri, obviously Plants, but everyone talks about Plants as the primary deck during that format. You have hero decks, you have Master Hyperion, Agent decks, and then you have Gravekeepers. I technically at that event played against the GB deck round 1, but GBs weren't especially good. There were a bunch of tier 2, 3 decks that you could probably add, but really, when I look back at that particular event at Columbus, it was a lot of Plant, a lot of Agent, and a lot of TG. That was really, after round 1 or 2, that's all I played for the whole tournament. My loss in Swiss was to actually the TG deck that I just profiled, or a version of it. And then in the top cut, it was just tons of Plants, a little bit of Karakuri and Agents. So how are we stopping this? Well, Tyler didn't play Cyber Dragon in his side deck of Toronto, but I think that was a little bit early in terms of Karakuri's popularity. I think people realized that Karakuri was a real deck after seeing it at Toronto. You know, Dale, Anthony Alvarado played it at Toronto and topped. Then players like Jeff Jones played it at Columbus. I love Cyber Dragon as a counter to that deck. And of course, you need to play a copy of Chimera Tech. Another decision point here is actually finding the spot for Chimera Tech in the extra deck naturally, so you can add another card to your side deck and not have to side in Chimera Tech. You know, if you don't think you're ever going to go into Scrap Archfiend, make that switch. I totally could see that being the case. So whether it's the 15th card in the side deck or the 15th card in the extra deck, we have to have, obviously, Chimera Tech with this. I'll be brutally honest. You could tell me that it's more valuable to play 2 Chimera Techs in the extra deck because of the matchup and not play cards like Scrap Archfiend and Gaia, because the likelihood of actually needing to go into any of these is so low. I could totally see that, but that's a decision that you can make if you want to go back and play this deck. So we have the Cyber Dragon package. We have Breaker and a DD Crow. This is reminiscent of Tyler's side deck. I might have even honestly bumped this up to 2 Breakers. I really love Breaker in mirror matches where your opponent's going to side out Skill Drain, you're going to side out Skill Drain, and it's a battle of resources, because this can pop an opponent's back row like Mirror Force or Horn of the Phantom Beast, and then even if you crash into a Rush Rhino or attack into something else, it's really not the absolute end of the world. So Breaker is pretty good in mirror matches like this. DD Crow was there obviously for the Plant deck and then a few other niche occasions. It could get rid of Grapha, so that was obviously another benefit too. When I played against decks like this, I tried to side out as much of the Plant stuff as I possibly could and actually tried to battle Stun deck versus Stun deck. You know, I would side decking cards like Breaker myself like I did at Toronto. So you might not actually even play against a Plant player that keeps something like Pot of Avarice in their deck. You might. It's probably more common to do that, but it is something to consider. But DD Crow, 3 copies of MST. This is obviously really valuable. Your deck doesn't really have any spell and trap destruction besides maybe Wonder Magician. And having access to MST against whether it's Gates of the Dark World or whether it's against another trap-heavy deck like Gravekeepers in the Mirror Match, really useful. Chain Disappearance, it actually adds some flexibility against the Agent deck. It's always been seen to be pretty decent against the Plant deck, and then it actually hits a few specific cards in the Karakuri deck. We have the Mind Crush Trap Dusty package. and then a Transmigration Prophecy. This is a side deck that is a combination of Robert Bayagin's and Tyler Nolan's from Toronto. And I tried to keep a few cards in here that I think would have been good for Columbus too, by putting the Kara Curry package in, or the anti-Kara Curry package. I think you could be justified with putting something like Gemini Imps or something more hardcore for Grapha-based decks and Dark World-based decks. I could see that being the case. Maybe you cut Chain Disappearance for Gemini Imps. But otherwise, I think all in all, the side deck does a pretty good job. This card is good against Dark World, this card is good against Dark World, and all three of these are good against Dark World. So I think you're actually in a pretty decent spot already with those. But if you wanted to cut the Chain Disappearances for some more hardcore anti-Dark World cards, I think you would be totally fine in doing so. But regardless, this is our first deep dive look at a TG variant, specifically a main deck exactly card for Tyler Nolan's deck from YCS Toronto, and then a side deck and extra deck that's been tweaked a little bit in order to replicate what it would have looked like at YCS Columbus. But nevertheless, that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.